I'm Bob Becker, Director of the Strom Thurmond Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program. I had the privilege of interviewing Charles Bierbauer for our radio show on public radio yesterday, and as I was preparing, I kept thinking, what am I going to do? This fellow is one of the most eminent interviewers in the country. And so I found it to be quite an entertaining and learning experience. When you look around at the programs, we're beginning our 10th season of the Calhoun Lecture Series, and it has taken on a life that contributes greatly to this campus, and we're grateful to the patrons of the Calhoun Lecture Series who contribute their time, their ideas, and their money to help support this program. So would you please give them a big hand, please? As many of you know, the founding chair of the Calhoun Lecture Series was Dr. Bill Hunter, and Bill recently passed away, and it's a great loss for all of us. But we're delighted this year to have as our co-chairs for the next 2 years, Bruce and Dot Yandel. So please welcome them as chairs of the Calhoun Lecture Program. Now, you may notice that this year we're going to be trying some new things, some new formats. Part of the format change is on stage. Following Mr. Bierbauer's formal presentation, we're going to have a little roundtable conversation with Charles, and the conversation is going to feature two professors from our political science department, Dr. Joe Stewart, who's the chairman of the political science department, and Dr. Adam Warber, who's a professor in political science and is a frequent guest on my radio show as we talk about various political and campaign type issues. So Adam and Joe, appreciate it, and following his presentation, you'll see them up on stage. You're also going to see that if you look at your program, we have a few interesting programs coming up that I want to call your attention to. The next Calhoun lecture is at an unusual time. It's on a Saturday, but it's the only time that we could really attract this person in, and he's coming into the area. Paul Farmer, many of you may be aware of his books and his work. It's been featured on 60 Minutes and other national programs. It's going to be a delightful program. He's a strong speaker, so make it part of your Saturday evening event on October 11th. Then, as we were thinking about what other changes we wanted to see the Calhoun Lecture Series have, we sat back and started realizing that Clemson itself is such a rich treasure trove of highly talented people. And maybe it's because you're often limited by the people in your own midst. What's the old cliche that the expert comes from 50 miles away? That we miss the talent that's around us. So beginning with this year, we're going to feature something special from Clemson with one of our own people. And this year we're starting out with a delightful, brilliant young man, Patrick McMillan, who heads the expedition programs for SCE-TV. So I think that'll be a delightful program and start highlighting our homegrown talent. Now, to properly introduce Charles Bierbauer, it's my pleasure to introduce the chairman of the political science department at Clemson University and a good friend of mine, Dr. Joe Stewart. Joe?
Thank you, Bob. Welcome everyone this evening to the Calhoun Lecture. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker this evening, who you've already met very briefly, Charles Bierbauer. As you know, Charles Bierbauer was the first dean of the College of Mass Communications and Information Studies at the University of South Carolina. Before that tragic turn in his career, and I'll let you decide what the tragedy is, going into university administration or being at the University of South Carolina, he had a very distinguished career as a journalist. Many of you in this room remember him, as I do, because he served for 20 years as a correspondent for CNN in Washington. During that time, for 9 years, he covered the Reagan and Bush administrations as the senior White House correspondent. He started at CNN as the Pentagon correspondent. He spent 5 terms as the network's Supreme Court correspondent. So he has truly covered Washington politics from a broad array of perspectives. Most relevant to what he's going to be talking about tonight, he covered every presidential campaign from 1984 until 2000. As Bruce Yandel suggested, Mr. Bierbauer has also spanned a wide variety of media, from the print media, radio, foreign correspondent, service reporter with Associated Press, and has covered the world from a wide variety of perspectives. Was reporter and producer for the Discovery Channel, the documentary on the World Trade Center Pentagon attacks, and then was also in Atlanta for the CNN coverage of the Olympic Park bombing, for which he received an Emmy. So and since he has gotten to the University of South Carolina, has won an Excellence in Teaching Award, nominated by a student in his media and government class, a topic in which I'm very interested. So it is my pleasure tonight to introduce Charles Bierbauer, who will talk to us about Saturation Point, the Multimedia Tsunami of Election 2008. Please help me welcome Charles Bierbauer.
Thank you and good evening. Thank you, Dr. Becker, Dr. Stewart. I was going to be nonpartisan, but I did hear that little reference back there about tragic turn in my career. This is only my second visit to Clemson, so I was very pleased to be invited to your campus. I'm also always eager to talk about a subject that is so much been an integral part of my professional life and is really an important component of our form of participatory democracy, that is the relationship of media and politics. And substantially, that's what we're going to talk a little bit about tonight. And I'm certainly delighted to be invited to participate in the Calhoun series and to be incorporated with a group that includes journalists such as Walter Mears, a friend from the Associated Press of many years, columnist Jack Anderson, Kathleen Parker, and others who have been here. My thanks to the Strom Thurmond Institute as well for including me in this distinguished series. I had a number of opportunities, as you may gauge, to observe and interview Senator Thurmond during my more than 20 years that I was a correspondent in Washington. As I'm sure you all recognize, Strom was unique. You could undoubtedly tell me more stories about him than I can tell you. I believe I may be one of only 3 people in the state of South Carolina who was not a Strom Thurmond intern at some point in Washington. In fact, my oldest son, Alec, was a Strom Thurmond intern, and he was a Pennsylvanian at the time. I'm going to talk a good bit about politics this evening, but I'm not going to do it from a partisan perspective. Ideally, at the end of the evening, you will know my perspective on politics, but you won't know my political persuasion. You could undoubtedly, I'm also going to try to avoid some of the partisanship that sometimes divides Clemson and Carolina. Let's leave that for the playing fields. I hope, though, that there may be some Carolina alumni among you. And I would tell you, it's incredibly hard to see you with those lights out there. But if there are some Carolina alumni and perhaps even some from our School of Journalism and Mass Communications or our School of Library and Information Science, both of which are part of my college, I welcome you. If you're there, wave, please. There must be some somewhere. There's one. Okay, thank you for coming. Not leaving me standing here alone in this. In the curious way in that programs such as this are arranged, we came up with a title for these remarks long before I sat down to organize and write them. That was a couple of months ago because programs have to be prepared and press releases have to be written. So based on the inundation of the presidential primary season, or was it 4 seasons, we decided to call this Saturation Point, the Multimedia Tsunami of Election 2008. Much too long a title, but sort of obligatory to have a colon in there somewhere for an academic presentation. It did not occur to me at the time we'd be in the middle of hurricane season, but maybe that is apt too. I'm going to assume that all of you watched some, perhaps a good bit, of the Democratic and Republican conventions over the past 2 weeks. You may have thought it was just a continuation of the Olympics, but without gymnastics. That's not quite the same thing. If there's anyone who missed that and would like a recap, let me know. But I suspect you all watched, and I suspect you probably watched both, or some of both conventions, not just one or the other. The numbers of Americans watching was phenomenal. According to Nielsen ratings, 38.4 million viewers watched Senator Obama's acceptance speech, even though it was on the night of the Carolina football game, topped by 38.9 million for Senator McCain, who did have the advantage of an NFL football lead-in on NBC, 37.2 million for Governor Palin, even 24 million for Senator Biden, rivaling the numbers that were drawn to the Olympics. I think it belies the notion that people find politics boring or that the conventions are just one big commercial for the two parties. People wanted to know what these candidates stood for. And the fact that Sarah Palin's audience was nearly as great as Senator McCain's, wow. Were we struck by the novelty of her situation? Of course we were. But we also wanted to learn a lot more about her. In that regard, Governor Palin captured for a moment the same kind of curious, tell me more about yourself, tell me more. Voters wanted to learn that about Obama. They want to learn that now about Palin. And that's been one of the phenomena of this campaign, is that the public, I feel, has been caught up in the campaign and wants to know more about these candidates, wants to be able to break out of the uncertainty and have a good sense of where we might be going after November. As citizens, we follow these elections for several reasons. If we are already supporting a candidate, we want especially to have our own beliefs supported and our preferences confirmed. We also want to know what the other side is saying. And those who may be undecided or wavering hope that somewhere amidst all the rhetoric and the razzmatazz, they'll have that aha moment that enlightens us as to how we might vote in November. I also watch the conventions with the additional perspective of having spent a fair amount of time on those platforms as a reporter over the span of 5 presidential campaigns. The way we cover and report on conventions and campaigns has evolved with some significant changes that I would like to talk about to some degree this evening. Not the least of which is the kind of constancy of information. CNN brought about one of the significant changes when it obliterated the daily news cycle. You know, you get a newspaper in the morning, newspaper in the evening, watch the evening news at 6 o'clock or 11 o'clock. And now what has evolved is this 24/7 flow of news, as we call it, a deadline every minute. And that certainly had an impact on the political campaigns. The internet produced the other cataclysmic change. We've gone from a lot of newspapers and a few broadcast outlets to fewer newspapers and thinner, I might note, and more broadcast choices through cable, and a seemingly unlimited number of choices and voices on the internet. Help me to the degree I can see you out there. How many of you still subscribe to a daily newspaper? More than one? None? Oh, good. How many of you watch the nightly news on one of the networks, ABC, NBC, CBS? Okay, often people aren't home at that time. Cable news, how many of you rely on CNN, Fox, Bloomberg, MSNBC? Okay. How many of you get your news from The Daily Show or The Colbert Report? Aha! The internet. Yeah, most of us, many of us. I considered bringing along some of my favorite clips from the campaign and treating you to a PowerPoint performance this evening, but it occurred to me that if we are, in fact, talking about the tsunami of media, you may already feel like you are drowning. Also, when I sat down the other evening to put these reflections together, I discovered that our internet connection was out. What? The internet is out? How am I going to do this? I have a 17-year-old son for whom cutting off the internet would be about like cutting off oxygen or hamburgers. I spent 4 hours this morning waiting for the cable guy to come back and restore our internet. So dependent we become on these sources of media. But in place of a multimedia display to dazzle and amuse you, we're going to have to go virtual tonight. I'll do the words, you do the effects if you choose. And when it's all done, we'll have a virtual balloon drop to celebrate what happens here. Political campaigns, especially presidential campaigns, can be divided essentially into three main parts. First, the primaries that occupy up to 6 months of the election year. Then there is the celebratory nominating conventions, which we just experienced, which then kick off the frantic 2-month rush between Labor Day and Election Day. There's also a prelude period in which the potential candidates test the waters, build their campaigns, raise tons of money, and try to stimulate your interest in their candidacies. That period has become so highly elastic to the degree that Election Day is also the launching day for the next campaign. Small wonder we feel inundated by the process. But 2008 has been unique. Certainly in my experience, we had not had a wide-open campaign in both parties since the 1950s, and wide open this one has proven to be. Let me focus these remarks, though, on the role of the media. Even though in South Carolina we saw plenty of the candidates prior to our primaries, it's still primarily through the media that voters are informed, educated, or baffled by the process. I suspect that many of you saw one or more presidential candidates live in the flesh in the course of the campaign, particularly as it led up to the South Carolina primaries. I certainly did. There were a lot of them going through Columbia. In the context of the media, let's touch on three bases: television, advertising, and the new media. How it was, how it is, and how it might be. It's a long history, but let me take just a moment. This intertwining of the press and the political process has its foundation back as far as the American Revolution, the advocacy of the colonial press, not just the kind of advocacy we're seeing today. You know, the leaflets of Tom Paine, the Federalist Papers, the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of the press. In fact, the First Amendment, in 45 concise and well-crafted words, gives us 5 of our cardinal freedoms: freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right of assembly, and the right of petition. Great writing, 45 words, and you get all that. As we moved on in the political process, the great Lincoln-Douglas debates were written up by the reporters dogging that campaign of the mid-19th century. As each new medium came along, it played a role in political coverage: radio, then television. My father was in the theater business and was what we would now call an early adapter of new technology. So we had one of the first television sets, big console, small screen, back in the late 1940s. And I actually remember, though this will date me as a child, somewhat distinctly the conventions of 1948 and 1952. Little did I know what lay ahead for me professionally. We're familiar with the impact that television has had. Take, for example, presidential debates, the most famous of those being the Nixon-Kennedy debate back in 1960, in which Nixon's sweaty brow and 5 o'clock shadow made him look unappealing and even untrustworthy, in contrast to the youthful and handsome Jack Kennedy. A now famous study of that debate revealed that television viewers clearly felt that Kennedy won the debate, but people who heard that debate on the radio thought Nixon had won. Style versus substance. What mattered? By the time I arrived in Washington in 1981, I had covered election campaigns in Great Britain, in Germany, and even the Soviet Union. Leonid Brezhnev's remarkable 1979 re-election campaign, in which he gave one speech and got more than 99% of the vote. Brezhnev was very persuasive. So I first hit the presidential trail in the 1984 campaign that wound up with Ronald Reagan winning re-election over Walter Mondale. There are basically two ways that journalists cover a campaign. One way is the crossroads method. You park yourself at some strategic junctures, such as Ottumwa, Iowa, or Orangeburg, South Carolina, and you catch all the candidates that pass that way. It's a good way to compare and contrast and see what works well, particularly during the candidate-rich primaries. The more conventional approach is for a reporter to hitch on to a candidate and hope to ride that race all the way to the White House. It can be an exhilarating ride and an exhausting one. You're on the road for weeks, 18-hour days, a blur of 5 a.m. wake-up calls, on the bus, off the bus, on the plane, off the plane. Listen to the speech, write your story on the plane, off the plane. Write another speech. Did he say anything different? Did he add some nuance? And then you stand up in front of your camera, you say something profound or insightful or mundane, and end it by saying, and I'm Charles Bierbauer, CNN, where are we? And I have done that. Those times hit you. Is it Iowa? Is it Indiana? I know it begins with an I, but I can't remember which one because we've been in all three of them in the course of a day. You may be familiar with a book about the campaign in the 70s by Timothy Krause called The Boys on the Bus. Krause describes the mostly male press corps as hard-working, hard-living, hard-drinking. The end of any day typically wound up in a hotel bar, not just for a drink, but because that's where the journalists and the campaign operators found common ground and shared information that would likely work its way into tomorrow's story. On my first campaign in 1984, just 24 years ago, we did not have laptop computers or cell phones, no Blackberries, no Trios, no iPhones. We still carried typewriters and telephone credit cards. And even when the most rudimentary computers came along, I think in the '88 campaign, they had to be coupled to the phones in primitive fashion to transmit scripts and stories. But by the time you got to the campaigns of the '90s, you started carrying all kinds of paraphernalia. Computers, cell phones, you'd be downloading and dumping information and scripts whenever you could at just about every stop. You could file radio stories on your cell phone in a motorcade in the din of a candidate's rally. Somewhere along the way in there, in the mid-'90s, Maureen Dowd of the New York Times wrote a somewhat tongue-in-cheek magazine article that suggested that the boys on the bus of Krause's day had made room for the women on the bus. I'm not going to call them girls, I don't take that risk. And the women had discovered that those hard-living, hard-drinking, and perhaps even romancing boys had been turned into techie nerds more likely to be exhausted by the stepped-up pace created by new technologies and more likely to be sleeping with their laptops than anything else. On a major campaign, by this time, where we are in the campaign now, CNN would have one, probably two correspondents, a producer or two, a camera crew, possibly an editor, traveling with each of the presidential candidates. Jet fuel was still cheap, but it cost a fortune to move that many people. This year's campaign, with 8 to 10 candidates on each slate, stretched all the media at a time when many organizations, particularly newspapers, were confronting declining circulation and advertising revenues. Organizations were forced to make some hard choices. How many candidates can we routinely cover? Which ones? What about the rest? Nothing, by the way. No amount of coverage will satisfy the Ron Paul faithful. Ever. In one dimension, the breadth of candidates, Obama, Clinton, McCain, Romney, on down to Paul and Kucinich, has made this campaign stand out. The spectrum of ideas and possibilities, the spectrum of platforms and potential that these candidates presented for us was unparalleled, and I think we benefit from that. Even by the fact that the campaigns lasted so long, that the decisions were not made by three relatively small and idiosyncratic states, Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, but that the voters in South Dakota even had some say in the matter. And then there's the state of the world, President Bush's low approval ratings, the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, economic chaos, energy dependencies, fuel costs. All of this made this a highly substantive and urgent campaign. In another dimension, The proliferating media environment in which we receive this information, the digital wave after wave, has given us extraordinary opportunities to be well informed, if we choose, and also urgent warning about being misinformed. Today's New York Times had an article back in the business pages. It's not about politics, but by way of example, what we're dealing with in this panoply of news media that we have now, many of them unchecked, unverified. And it's about a report that came out yesterday regarding United Airlines. And just a couple brief passages to underscore this. An erroneous headline that flashed across trading screens Monday saying United had filed for a second bankruptcy sent the airline's stock plummeting. United blamed an old Chicago Tribune article that it said was posted on the website of the South Florida Sun-Sentinel newspaper. That article was picked up by a research firm, Income Securities Advisors, which then posted a link to it on a page on Bloomberg News, which sent a news alert based on the old article. Chicago, Florida, security firm, Bloomberg. This thing is careening like a ping pong ball through the technology world. The newspaper's editor in the Tribune Company, which also owns the Sun-Sentinel, denied that the paper had run the article on its website, saying it could be found only in its archives. The episode was a reminder of how negative news, rumors, and even outdated articles can travel at lightning speed, with some investors selling before pausing to check facts, which is the great caveat emptor for all consumers of news, be it political or business or anything else. Let the viewer and the readers beware. Why? Well, consider how the information waves, the tsunami, are layered upon us. You get information directly from the candidates in all likelihood, email, voicemail, snail mail. At least once a day, there is some communication that I get from each of the campaigns. I'm still getting messages from the Huckabee campaign. The internet has dramatically enhanced the ability of politicians to reach voters directly, avoiding what they call the media filter. Now, this is not new. Direct mail has been around for decades, and it was used to accomplish the same thing. But the internet makes it so much more facile. Senator McCain says something, and within minutes, there's a follow-up and a reaction on Senator Obama's email or on his website, and vice versa. They can reach you. You can find them. You could go to Obama.com or McCain.com and all the permutations you can think of. And then I wrote that and I said, well, let me check that. Because I wrote it rather blithely and I thought, So I went to Obama.com and it turns out to be a Japanese website for I know not what. And McCain.com is the homepage of McCain Foods Limited, the world's largest producer of frozen French fries. Caveat emptor. So, should you want to know where Barack Obama stands on troop withdrawals, for example, it's www.barackobama.com. And if you want John McCain's energy policy, it's www.johnmccain.com. That's one of the problems, finding the sources, dealing in this terra incognita of the internet. And please be careful if you go to whitehouse.com because it's a porn site. You don't want to go there. All of this is valuable information. All of it is out there for the consumer in this political season that is probably as important as any, although in the media we say every political season is the most important. The information is there, it's direct, it's unfiltered. The campaigns say what they want to say, but that's only one perspective. Want another point of view? Enter the blogosphere. Enter at your own risk, of course. It is an unregulated frontier, more wild and woolly and lawless than the 19th century American West when Jesse James and his gang was robbing trains. more wild and woolly than Afghanistan's Tora Bora when you're trying to find Osama bin Laden. Beware the blogosphere. How many blogs are there? Anybody got a guess? Too many. Probably right. According to the blog Herald, which follows these things, and citing Technorati, which is a website, it says it is tracking more than 112.8 million blogs, a number which, it goes on to say, does not include the 72.82 million Chinese blogs that have been counted by the China Internet Network Information Center. The good news is that even if there are 112 million blogs, no one is paying any attention to 111,990-some thousand, which is okay, because most are irrelevant. Many are irrational. Some are very personal. Some are highly partisan, often single-issue diatribes, much as stream of consciousness, blather, screed, or worse. And yet, some blogs are terrific. They're insightful work done by seasoned political reporters who have gone to the blogs because it gives them such latitude and such elastic space to work. Politico, Daily Kos, Huffington Post, and more. Good political journalism is being done on the WashingtonPost.com, on CNN.com, and other web pages for the mainstream media. And one of the other things that has caught my attention is on CNN, John King has been doing exceptional work with this piece of demographic paraphernalia that he has, this electronic screen where he can break down by district who's voting and how they're voting and which districts to watch. There's just a wealth of data out there that needs that kind, to my thinking, that kind of explanation and analysis. And CNN invested a ton of money, I forget the number, but it's in hundreds of thousands of dollars just on this one piece of equipment, on the software, so that it can take South Carolina apart and say, if Clemson votes this way, it means this. If you want to see your candidate in action, you can always check YouTube, and the candidates have caught on to that. They themselves have realized that this is a venue to reach younger voters. We've had the YouTube debates. One of them, the Democrats, was down in Charleston at the Citadel. It was at times a bit quirky. Governor Romney initially balked at participating in the follow-on Republican YouTube debate because he didn't want to be questioned by a snowman. Nonetheless, you could arguably ask, was it good for the political process? Was it good television? Was it good theater? It was different, and there's nothing that says only journalists can ask effective questions. Let me turn to political advertising, because it's also made itself known on the internet. Quoting from USA Today, which cites Google as having seen exponential growth in sales of sponsored link ads to the major presidential campaigns in 2008. And by that, what is happening is, it says, advertisers bid to post sponsored links next to the results for certain words typed at Google's main search page, so that if you are going to a campaign page or something, and maybe you're looking up Iraq, or you're looking up gas prices, you will get a sponsored ad that will pop up in correlation with the word that's focused in that article that you are looking at, and it will have a response to it. It's what you can do with this stuff. Those of you who are, this is Clemson, you know about computers up here. But if you're working in that realm, you know the ability to make these links, to make these connections is phenomenal in a way that never existed before with that kind of exactitude. Overall, political campaigns at all levels will spend several billion dollars on advertising in the 2008 election cycle. An exact figure is difficult to pin down because of the complexity of the process, the degree of reporting that's required for some purposes, and the inexactitude of tracking all of the peripheral spending. If you consider all the fuss we make about Super Bowl ads every year, Fox Sports sold, I think, all of the 63 spots available in the last Super Bowl at an average of $2.7 million for 30 seconds, and that would have netted or grossed Fox about $170 million. Not a bad day's gross. But we're talking about billions. Obama tried to buy a Super Bowl ad, by the way, and was turned down by Fox. Obama and McCain each spent some $5 million for ads during the Beijing Olympics. The totality, though, in increments that start with a few $100s for an ad on WYFF or WSPA, or a couple $1,000s for local television, which is still the primary medium for political advertising, it's expected to soar to somewhere between $3 and $5 billion during the 2008 campaign. There are just a number of estimates in circulation, so it's hard to pin it down. One organization, PQ Media, which is an ad and marketing research firm in Connecticut, predicted earlier this year that there would be a 43% leap from the 2004 cycle and a record $4.5 billion for all expenditures, marketing and advertising, two-thirds of it advertising. Political advertising certainly challenges the voter. What's accurate? What's hyperbole? What's an outright lie? Does negative advertising work? Evidence suggests it does, and most campaigns can't wait to go negative. Some interests, presumably beyond the campaign's control, though, that can be argued, are happy to attack on the candidate's behalf. Example, the Swift boat ads against Democrat John Kerry in 2004, challenging his war record in Vietnam. The Willie Horton ads of 1988 put Michael Dukakis on the defensive. The Daisy ad, run only once by the Lyndon Johnson campaign in 1964, made Republican Barry Goldwater appear to be the scariest man you'd want to put next to the nuclear button. And we know too well here in South Carolina how in 2000 the Bush campaign viciously undercut John McCain. There's an organization, or there's a website that's very good about analyzing and calling to truth the political ads. It's called factcheck.org, factcheck.org. It's run by Brooks Jackson, who was a colleague of mine at CNN and is now with the Annenberg School of Journalism at the University of Pennsylvania. So if you're not certain, that's the place to find out. One more point before we open up a dialogue here. If the ads can be misleading, what about the reporting? Is there media bias? You've been waiting for this, haven't you? Well, is there? Yeah, sure. But let's define and refine what we mean by bias. Subjectivity, prejudice, slant, distortion. There are lots of words to describe it. One man's bias might be another's truth, and truths, too, can be subjective. We're 2 days away from the anniversary of 9/11. In the wake of that tragedy, Bill Kovach, a respected, even revered journalist who used to be the editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and now heads the Project for Excellence in Journalism in Washington, said, "Sure, I've got a bias. I'm biased against people who fly airplanes into skyscrapers full of innocent victims." And in the wake of 9/11, we saw a lot of journalists espouse that position, to some degree almost too much. There was this explosion of flags and banners, and everything was red, white, and blue all across the media. The media's job is to be dispassionate, neutral. When I was the ABC correspondent in Moscow in the late 70s, my job was to report on the political, military, and economic tensions of the Cold War. The bias I had to work with was one in which I felt the American system of freedoms, even if flawed, was vastly superior to the Soviet system of fear and control. But I wasn't hired to exhibit my biases. I grew up journalistically in an age when news and opinion were clearly separated. The news was on the front page. The opinion was on the editorial page. Thoughtful, reasoned analysis fit in between. That's changed. The lines have been blurred, if not erased, in the media. Whether it's Rush Limbaugh railing against liberals on the radio, Keith Olbermann beating up on President Bush on MSNBC, or Lou Dobbs on CNN ranting against immigrants, the cacophony is often disturbing. This is not, though, entirely new. Again, go back to the colonial press in this country. It was highly opinionated and not very fond of the British and their Tory supporters. Publisher William Randolph Hearst flourished in the age of yellow journalism and famously told a photographer that he'd stationed in Cuba, "You provide the pictures and I'll provide the war." In other countries, the press is traditionally allied with political parties. The period of press objectivity during which most of us grew up in the middle to late 20th century is more the anomaly than the practice, and we've ebbed away from that. Yet, having grown accustomed to objectivity, I think a lot of us are uncomfortable with much of what we experience now. And because we have a penchant for hanging labels on things, we tend to say that Fox News is fair and balanced, I heard somebody say. Well, that's always encouraging. MSNBC? Biased. Which way? Oh, left. Keith Olbermann and Chris Matthews have lost their anchor chairs for coming political events, probably for being too strident in that regard. CNN? Yeah, you're not sure. That's good. New York Times? Wall Street Journal? There's a real distinction between the Wall Street Journal editorial page and its content. Take a look at that sometime. Certainly the journal's page editorial page is very conservative. But these are fairly stereotypical labels to hang on things, and it's okay because you've established a framework in which to deal with different media entities. I mean, you may be wrong on certain instances. For example, Fox News anchor Greta Van Susteren is anything but conservative. When she was at CNN, we sometimes cringed because we thought she was an apologist for the Clintons. A few years ago, then CBS correspondent Bernard Goldberg wrote first an op-ed piece for the Wall Street Journal and then a book called Bias, accusing the networks, especially CBS, of having a liberal bias. In one passage, he cites a CBS producer who purportedly says, "Of course there's a liberal bias, Bernie, but I'll deny I ever said that." Now, Goldberg asks the right questions. Is there bias? And if so, how do I recognize it? But his answers are weak and unpersuasive to the degree that he doesn't substantiate the claims that he makes. But the questions are good. So let me posit this. There is bias in the American media. It is, to my thinking, primarily a selection bias, leaving aside the Lou Dobbs and the Obermans and a few others at this point. By that I mean that the editors and the reporters choose certain stories that they want to tell. We are first and foremost storytellers. Most reporters are agnostic in that regard. We like to tell good stories. Sometimes good stories are bad stories. Occasionally good stories are good stories. Black and white, it's relatively easy to relate to. We tend to be bored easily with neutrality, ambiguity, and shades of gray. So faced with another ho-hum story about gas prices going up, gas prices going down, or a story about, say, how the governor of Alaska wants to go out and drill for oil, Governor Palin wins hands down. That's a good story. What is she up to? Are the media out to get the Republican vice presidential nominee? No. I'll quibble with you on that one. Not out to get her. They're out to figure out who she is. We know Joe Biden. He's not a new story. But Sarah Palin is a fascinating choice because we know so little about her, or did until a week ago, and we've only begun to scratch the surface. Bill Kristol, the conservative columnist, has a column in today's New York Times. You may have seen it. It's titled "A Heartbeat Away." And he talks in there a bit about how the media are covering Governor Palin, and says of the media, they're offended that McCain picked Palin without, so to speak, consulting them. The establishment media takes pride in its role as gatekeeper to our political process and social discourse. So the gatekeeper media's reaction has been, who is Sarah Palin to suddenly show up on the national stage? We didn't vet her, and we don't approve of her. I would quibble with Bill, and Bill's a friend. He should know better. He's been through this before. He was chief of staff to Vice President Dan Quayle. Sarah Palin is, to the campaign of 2008, what Dan Quayle was in the campaign of 1988. She is little known, has a sparse public record, and is an intriguing element in the McCain equation for winning the election. And so a candidate who espouses conservative family values, opposes abortion, and has a pregnant, unmarried 17-year-old daughter merits some scrutiny. It's not about the daughter, it's about the mother. A candidate who, as mayor, sought to remove books from the town library raises questions about her respect for the First Amendment. Now, I've got a bias on that. I'm the dean of the School of Library and Information Science. And more power to the librarian in Wasilla, Alaska, who, when asked, "Would you mind if we took some books out of here?" said, "Yes, I would mind." That's a story. That's worth knowing. That fills in our perspective on who she is. Is it news? I think it is. I think it's a useful story. So on any given day, the media make choices about what to cover, what's essential. Is our neighborhood, our community, our country safe? What's exhilarating? Feats of accomplishment. What's appalling? Crime and inhumanity. What's titillating? Sex and scandal. What's the audience want to know? What sells newspapers, TV shows? These are, after all, businesses that try to deliver a product, in this context, the news. And we've heard much lament about the dying media. When I talk to our students in the School of Journalism, and they say, or we discuss, well, this paper's lost 10% of its jobs and that paper's lost 10% of its jobs, I'm not worried about those 10%, nor should those students be, because those aren't the jobs they're looking for. It's the 90% that remain. Those are the jobs that we need to gear them for. And that's what our focus is. So the smart news organizations are going to survive this, and they will transform, and they will remain vital, and they will engage you on all these different media devices that we have now and others yet to come. And I'm afraid the tsunami is liable to go on in that regard. But as Bill Kovach and his co-author Tom Rosensteel tell us in a couple of their books about the media, by and large, the media don't tell us what to think, but they do tell us what to think about. At least that's what I think. We can cue the balloon drop here. And I thank you for your attention. I thank you for this opportunity to be with here. And I think my colleagues are going to join me on stage here. And who knows where this dialogue will go from here. Thank you all.
If you would like to sit in the middle.
Okay, I thought I would start off with the first question. You've painted a picture of this tsunami of information, and it seems to me that one of your solutions is that the buyer has to beware, or the caveat emptor. But we know that the American public doesn't have a whole lot of information. The Pew survey of 2 years ago showed that only 40% of the U.S. population could tell us that there were 3 branches of government and name those 3 branches. So how optimistic are you of the solution to dealing with this tsunami?
Well, one would like to be optimistic, and one has to be optimistic, because I think it is such a foundation stone of what we have built here. To take any position that suggests, oh, well, it's okay not to have that much information is alarming. I mean, then we're evolving towards that Leonid Brezhnev one speech, 99% of the vote. Now, that's an extremist, of course. What we need to be is much more effective in our education system. If there is anything, and this is a great place to state this because we're not likely to get massive opposition to it, we've got to do a better job of educating young people and getting them engaged and getting them involved. But I've been impressed with the level of interest that our young people have had. I have seen Senator Obama, Senator Clinton, all of these folks on the campus down in Columbia, and I've certainly seen young people come out intrigued, interested, curious, and often very, very enthused by what is going on. So that's a positive step. They get involved, they work on campaigns. Now maybe those are the ones I'm seeing, and maybe they're not the ones that are out in other colleges scattered across the campus, but I don't think that's true. Obama has brought new people to the table. He has gotten not just young folks, but people who may not have been involved in the process. Whether he wins or loses, that's a significant contribution. But then all of us have got to do a better job of educating at that very basic level what those three branches of government may be. Now, I had a conversation. I take students up to Washington every spring as part of this class on media and government, and we make the rounds kind of behind the scenes. And in one instance, we were at the Supreme Court meeting with Justice Scalia, who said, maybe it's okay that not everybody votes because not everybody's terribly well informed. That's Justice Scalia's perspective, needless to say, not necessarily mine. My job is to inform.
You talk about this 24/7 reporting that goes on, and there's a debate among scholars as to whether or not we're in this period of sensationalism, where the news has moved away more from objective reporting to where you've got ratings are very important. Certainly the announcement of Sarah Palin is breaking news, but this day and age, when Paris Hilton goes shopping for a new pair of shoes, that's also breaking news. And so I guess my question for you is, first of all, what do you see the trend of the media in the last probably 20 years? Has it gone in the direction of more sensationalism, or do you think that not as much really has changed? And number two, if it is more sensational than it was, is that good for American democracy?
Context is important. Is my mic on for the back there? Because that's what I thought. I don't know if that's something I was supposed to do. They said not. But technology. I don't want to do anything. Here we go.
Not accidental that we get someone younger out to
Yeah.
explain to us how to do this.
How about now? Whoa. Yeah. Good.
Mine was, yeah.
Yeah, I think everyone else was working. Everyone else is working? No?
Yours is not running.
It's a conspiracy, Charles.
This is why I waited 4 hours for the cable guy this morning to do something I could not do. And he came in and he told me, oh, it's been programmed incorrectly. Okay. Well, your question, yeah, is it more sensational? Historically, no. I mean, you can go back, pick any decade you like. You and I have all each stood in the supermarket checkout line and noted that the Martians had come again. And you can't escape that stuff. What is different, of course, is the ubiquity. It's everywhere. It's in my pocket. My cell phone is probably loading messages now from the Obama campaign and the McCain campaign, or other things that I'd rather not discuss that I can't filter out because they just won't. And so is it? No, I think it is simply that we are exposed to it in so many more ways. The immediacy, it's not pick up the newspaper off the driveway in the morning. It's just on. The TV is on all the time. I mean, I'm a television person, so I tend to have it on. Interestingly, I keep the television in my office it's not in my line of sight. I'm not watching it. I'm listening, maybe for an audio cue that says, oh, that's interesting. And the sensationalism has always been there. And we need to be selective viewers, readers, consumers. If we care about Paris Hilton's shoes, fine, we'll pay attention to it, and if not, not.
Do you think some of that with the mainstream media where people are looking at like CBS News and some of the major networks on the traditional channels where people have said that over the last 10 years we've started to see changes to where they try to do like the cable networks, which make them look a little more sensational? Do you think more of it is just a product of all of this instant communication and they're trying to compete where you have all these other access points where we can get information now, and so it's more of a sign of some of those trying to struggle and keep up with those changes?
It's evolutionary. We're adapting to a new media environment. It's a different paradigm. The networks, the broadcast networks, CBS, ABC, and NBC, have in many regards sort of ceded the ground to the cable networks, so that during the conventions did not start at 10 o'clock at night in Denver and St. Paul. They ran all day long with lots of speeches and lots of procedures, and CNN and the others covered it gavel to gavel. You could turn on C-SPAN and watch the entirety of it if you chose to. But what the three networks chose to do was to say, we'll give you an hour. And they did this 2 cycles, 3 cycles back under the presumption that people were not all that willing, and they had an alternative. They had another place. Go watch it on MSNBC, watch it on CNN or Fox News. And that way they could still run their soap operas during the day for those who wanted to watch it. That's okay. It's changing. It's not set in stone.
You've noticed or noted that in history, journalism in many ways didn't pretend to be neutral. For those of us that have spent time reading the Tallahassee Democrat or various media that very clearly labeled themselves, that reflected that history. As the dean, and you've noticed that in some ways we seem to be returning at least somewhat with the Keith Olbermanns of the world. Reflect on that as the dean of a school of journalism now. Or I'm sorry, I haven't memorized the full title of your school. But
It's too long. The obligation that we have is, and I used to say when I was a correspondent, I'm not ready to give up my job to some 25-year-old whippersnapper fresh out of journalism school. Now my objective is to make sure that 24, 25-year-old fresh out of journalism school or with a year or two under her belt is primed and ready to go. And while we are attentive to the new media environment, because we have to be, I had the general manager of one of the Columbia television stations the other day said, I've hired my last reporter. What do you mean by that? He said, well, I'm not going to hire just reporters. Every reporter who comes in here is going to be handed a camera. They're going to be a shooter. They're going to be an editor. They've got to be able to write for the internet. We're in this sort of jack of multiple trades position, but we want the student to graduate from our program with some ability to move across platforms, because that's what the marketplace is demanding, but with very strong foundations of being able to write, ethics. My mantra is every course should be an ethics course, every course should be a writing course. If you can't do that, doesn't matter how good you are with the gadgetry, you've still got to be able to take those bits and pieces of information, figure out which ones are relevant, make sense out of it, and communicate it. And those are writing skills, those are critical thinking skills. That's intrinsic to the program that we have. And I think to most of the solid journalism schools. But there is a real debate within the academy among schools of journalism, schools of mass communication, whatever they choose to call themselves, as to how far do we go with the technology, knowing that the technology we have, that we stay up on software, it's impossible to stay up with all the developments because the money just doesn't come along fast enough to do that. But it's not impossible to stay up with the greatest tool that the students have got, and that's the mind. And they're adept, and they will learn on the job.
Just a question on the election that we're dealing with. How would you say the media is doing in terms of reporting? Because we're getting a lot of criticism about the McCaincom thinks that it's biased against Sarah Palin, and some people think it's biased against Obama.
Yeah, the general feeling is if you're being sniped at from both sides, you're probably doing all right. No campaign is ever going to be satisfied with the coverage that it gets. Let me go back a few years. In the 1992 campaign, George Herbert Walker Bush versus Bill Clinton, I remember being on a campaign with President Bush at that time, and this would have been about mid-October, and he was just complaining about how he was being unfairly treated by the media. They were going back and raising questions about, well, what were your contacts with Saddam Hussein prior to the war, and dredging up some of these things, which were reasonable concern. But his complaint was, you're not doing this with Bill Clinton. You're only beating up on me. And it struck me as having lost sight of the fact that in the spring, during the primary season when President Bush was not campaigning, everybody was beating up on, so to speak, Governor Clinton, because all of those issues were scrutinized. So there was a disconnect in terms of time. But on balance, I think the media are going to be as scrutinizing of each campaign. You can pick it apart and say, aha, but what about him? Well, maybe he's leaning one way or another. But I think on balance, we're kind of equal opportunity critics.
Let me ask you to comment. This was my first primary season since moving to South Carolina. And one of the things that impressed me was the number of foreign media with whom I interacted. Now, one could see that as an alternative source of information, and certainly people who watch the news on foreign media often find it very different than when watches it on domestic media. Or one could just see it as another set of voices out here in this mass confusion that we have. What reflect some for us on?
Well, the foreign media look at the American elections as having an impact on them. This is, among all the countries of the world, the one that has some impact everywhere. Elections in Finland do not have a lot of impact here, but elections here do in Finland, or in China, or just about anywhere. On primary night, I did interviews, and you probably did some as well. I did interviews as the so-called expert on the local scene with Japanese television, with, trying to remember, the BBC, with Al Jazeera, because these are foreign correspondents coming in saying, so tell me what's happening here and what does it mean? I did the same thing when I was a correspondent abroad in Germany or Britain covering elections there. People want to know what impact the vote in South Carolina will have and how it will carry on. So they add to the breadth of perspectives. There aren't that many people here who are watching how that coverage might have an impact, but I think the campaigns are watching because they want to know how this is playing in other countries. Foreign policy is an essential piece of any candidate's collection of platform planks.
Adam, we've probably got time for one more question.
Well, I'm going to ask you a question related to kind of the newer generation now with the news. And you talk about YouTube and all that, where most people now, 40 years or younger, YouTube is kind of a major part of our life. And the question, I guess, is how has the media adapted to that? where now people can go on and scoop a story if they want to, or put things on that, let's say, maybe the traditional media outlets are working on, but you're doing your fact checking and you're making sure before you report a story you've got everything, and then they come in and they scoop it. Or you've got people out there like the Drudge Report and things like that
Yeah,
cause that.
the Drudge Report is a good example of how the traditional journalistic methods have been altered, because Matt Drudge, who has to some degree become mainstream media now, but was not back in the mid-90s. The Drudge Report broke the story on Monica Lewinsky. Newsweek had been working on that story. Newsweek pretty much had that story nailed down, but there were a couple little things that they wanted to check, and as a weekly magazine, their deadline was on Friday night. So they got to that stage and they said, no, we're going to hold it over one more week because we want to check out a couple little things. And you know, over the weekend, the Drudge Report broke the story about the little blue semen-stained dress, and you know, everything is history from there. The next 18 months were consumed by the Clinton impeachment. Newsweek wasn't dramatically hurt by that. Newsweek then developed the fuller story, presented all that it had. Drudge had a little bit of the story and got the attention. And I think to some degree that's true of what happens with the internet in general. YouTube, things can get posted there. If you're a television network, you may be sending a feed from Clemson to New York, and it goes up on a satellite and someone intercepts it and pulls it off. And those things will happen. But bear in mind that YouTube and all these other things are dealing in relatively smaller numbers. And the mainstream media, the NBC News and CBS News and ABC News, still have substantially larger numbers of viewers than do CNN and MSNBC or Fox, although during the conventions, the highest numbers were counted by CNN and Fox. So there's going to be an ebb and flow to that. I don't think people are quite as concerned about something being broken on the web anymore. And in fact, the mantra in the journalism business these days is break it on the web. If you've got a story, you don't wait for the morning newspaper or the evening newscast. You break the story on the web, you update it and fill it out and flesh it out in the next available medium that you've got. And because all the news organizations are operating across media, CNN.com is going to have that story first, and Wolf Blitzer will have the story in an expanded form at 6 o'clock, and Anderson Cooper will have it in yet another dimension at 10 o'clock or whenever he comes on. And so you kind of team up and gang up on it. And YouTube is quirky. YouTube is sometimes funny, sometimes appalling. But it's something I think we have to deal with, and this may be a weird tangent to kind of wrap up on, but the other night I was sitting at home and my 17-year-old son called down from upstairs, and I don't know whether he was studying his biology or not, but he said, "Dad, do shrimp have legs?" Do shrimp have legs? Yeah, they do, I think they do. Because I pick them off when you boil you have a shrimp boil, you've got to pull those things off. But I went to YouTube, and I typed in, on my iPhone, and I typed in shrimp and legs. And I got a video, I swear, of a shrimp on a treadmill. And it ran, set to music, and it ran for about a minute and a half. And there's this shrimp going like crazy. And what was really cool was I was able to go up and tell my 17-year-old, hey, look what I found on YouTube. So check it out, shrimp have legs. It's there. It is now a tool.
Yeah.
It's only a tool. And something else will replace it. And I'm not disturbed by that. So the tools that I grew up with, stone tablets and chisels and things of that sort, are a little heavy to carry around. Nothing's set in stone anymore. And I think that's just fine. We will adapt to it, so long as the content is solid. And if you talk to people in my business, they will still say content is king. Back in the 1960s, Marshall McLuhan, who was something of a television guru, a media guru, wrote, "The medium is the message." And he was talking about television and how television was going to displace everything. And I've become an anti-McLuhan person in the sense that maybe he was right for the 60s, but he's not right for the 21st century. The message is still the message. This gadget in my coat pocket is just a device. And it will be succeeded by something else. So stay on message.
Thank you, Charles. We appreciate it. Enlightening evening. Thank you.
Joe and Adam, thank you very much. And Charles, a little something to take back with you.
Ooh, something orange.
And we'd like you to take the Thurman cup with you also. You have coffee at an appropriate vessel.
I certainly will. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you all for attending this evening.
Drive carefully, please.